In today's drawing tutorial, we're going to be learning how to draw Monsteras. So grab your pen, I'm using a 0.05 UniPin Fineliner, and a piece of paper, and I'm using Stonehenge White. As you can see, I've already started drawing one leaf of my Monstera. This is to give you an idea of the shape we're about to draw. So grab your pen and get ready. We're going to be drawing our leaf in different segments today. This will make it a little bit easier when we're breaking it down, so we're not drawing the entire thing. Instead, we're breaking it into these smaller areas. We're going to start with this little dip here at the very top, or I guess the bottom, of the Monstera leaf, where the stem will eventually attach. Follow my lead as I draw these curved lines to make up each segment. You can see that I leave a sharp little turn, and then go in with a curve, and then repeat the pen strokes again. Each of the 5 segments we're drawing will be slightly different. Monsteras are, of course, plants and they're found in nature, so nothing is perfect. You'll see that sometimes my leaves, the segments are a little bit wonky or a little bit larger than the next, and that's totally okay. We're going to connect the final largest segment together with a little point at the top, and that is the very top of our leaf. Next, we're going to divide each segment of the leaf into even smaller sections, starting with this middle line down the center of the leaf. Draw very, very lightly with your fineliner pen. We don't want to press too hard, so applying very little pressure to the pen. Next, we're going to be going from that center line and then bringing a curved line. We're going to be doing one on each section all the way to the tip of that segment. Like we did with the center line, we're going to be drawing very lightly and also having each line be double-sided so that you can see a strip of white paper in between each line. I'm going to go all the way around for a total of 6 little lines that further divide our leaf. Make sure that each of your lines are very slightly curved in the same direction as your leaf. This makes it not look too geometric, instead it has nice natural curves. Now it's time to start shading. We're going to be shading segment by segment, so each of the segments that we drew those lines in to divide. Start out very light, so we're not putting too much pressure on the pen still, because we don't want to go too dark too fast. We can always darken our shadows, but we can't go back in and make highlights brighter, so be really cautious with how much pressure you're applying to your pen. Each pen stroke should be slightly curved and in the same direction as the leaf lines that you drew to divide each segment. This ensures that our leaf ends up looking very organic rather than geometric. If we add in too many straight lines, then we'll start to see sort of more rigid leaves, whereas we want it to be flowing and natural. It's also super important that each of the pen strokes we put on our paper for shading touch the next. So we don't want big gaps between each of these little shading lines we're doing now, because then it just won't look as though it's a sort of cohesive leaf. It will look very separated, very choppy, whereas we want it looking smooth and really have a flow to the shading. For each segment, we're starting darkest by the line in the middle, and then darkest also at the edges of the leaf, which with the highlight being right in the middle. So slowly applying less pressure for each of these pen flicks, each of these pen strokes. You can see here that I'm going in and just cleaning up a few little things. So starting out dark at the center and at the edges, but getting lighter and lighter towards the center by applying less and less pressure to the pen. You can practice different pressures on your pen off to the side of your drawing. So pressing harder to get darker and putting not as much pressure on your pen, lightening up the pressure in order to make your lines lighter as well. It's really important that we get those nice bright highlights at the center so we see lots of contrast between the edges and center of the leaf and the very center of the segments. As you draw, you may find some of your pen strokes go over your original outline. If that's the case, you can just do like I'm doing here and just very lightly clean up the edges. Make sure you're not pressing too hard when you're cleaning up the edges of your leaf because you really don't want that outline to be the main focus. But if you just lightly go around your leaf again, then you'll have nice clean edges to each segment of your leaf. Try not to make each of your pen strokes too short. You want them to extend from the center of the leaf to the center of each segment and from the edge of the leaf to the center of the segment in nice, long, sort of curved pen strokes. This makes sure that your shading doesn't look choppy and instead it flows and gives that sort of natural wave to the leaf. As you can see, I keep going back and cleaning up the edges a little bit, not making them too dark, making them sort of blend into that darkest shading on the edge of the leaf. I almost begin to think of each segment as its own little drawing. Although I know it will end up being one Monstera leaf, I focus on the shading of each segment and how the curve of the leaf works in that particular segment, and then I kind of join them together as I go. I like to leave those little segment lines white in the middle to make them really pop, but you can go back in and make them a little bit darker if you would like, if you find that they're standing out too much. But that can come a little bit later after we're done shading each of the segments. You can see here I'm avoiding going over those center segment lines. If you know my drawings, you know I love a dramatic shadow. So here I am going in a little bit harder with my pen, a little bit more pressure on that pen to really make those shadows pop. And here I am just darkening some of those lines a little bit. Not too much, mostly just around the edges in the center. Okay, now it's time for you to try the other side of the leaf by yourself. Remember, not pressing too hard at first, really light pressure because you can always go back and darken it. This is a good place to pause the video if you need to catch up. I'll just clean up the edges a little bit more while we wait, and then we can get started on the stem. Okay, for the stem, we're going to be connecting it to this center line here in the middle. You can see we left that center line, like the segment lines, unshaded so that it pops out. You could have added in a little bit of shading if you wanted to, but you didn't have to add too much because we still want it to stand out against the rest of the leaf. We're going to start by drawing just a little curve here at the top, and then continuing the stem out at the bottom. Use two lines that are very, very close to each other, just to give a nice thin Monstera stem. You can see I've curved it because I really want to keep up with that sort of idea of nature and flowing and just not having it be too rigid. Your Monstera stem is going to have the darkest shading at the top. You can see here I'm just very lightly shading in the same direction as my original stem lines, adding a little bit more layering of my pen at the top to make it darker, and then a little bit more to the right side, and leaving the left side of the stem just a little bit lighter to give that idea of a shadow and a highlight. Very simple, very straightforward. The main part is just making sure that you keep a highlight. And that's one leaf done. If you're feeling super ambitious, you can create a whole Monstera plant. First by doing the very light outlines, and then the segment lines to divide each leaf even more, and then the stems, and then going in with the shading. The most important things to remember when you're shading, of course, number one, is paying attention to how much pressure you're putting on the pen. Darkest at the center of the leaf and the edges, and the least amount of pressure in the very center of each segment for that highlight. Remember that each of your pen strokes, each of those tiny little lines you're drawing with your fineliner pen should be touching so that it's not choppy, it's not rigid. Instead, you have these smooth flowing leaves where there are no white gaps of paper between each of them. Instead, they're layered on top of one another and there's no spaces in between. And finally, make sure that you're curving each one of those tiny little shading lines. This will make your piece appear so much more natural, as though your leaves are flowing, blowing in the wind, or just alive in general, instead of being geometric and sort of still shapes. Really paying attention that you're going all in the same direction with your shading to make it more cohesive and more natural piece. Your Monsteras can be in a vase, they can be growing from the ground, it's totally up to you. Remember to keep practicing, keep drawing those Monstera leaves, and visit my other tutorials for more tips on drawing botanicals and other objects.